I was reading one of your articles, and in one of that articles, you have mentioned that the Aristotle's idea of hierarchy of being was behind the idea that human beings are different than other species. You seem to challenge that point. Are you essentially arguing Aristotle was wrong?
So Aristotle's worldview, both was his scientific worldview, was rather simplistic. Well, we can't fault him for that. That was more than 2,000 years ago, of course. He had this idea that nature is organized in a discrete hierarchy of beings. So you can think of it as boxes, right? So he had like one box for human beings at the top. Then there's another box that contains animals. Well, maybe one box like for each species. And then one step down further, there's plants and then inanimate objects. So he thought of nature as a hierarchy where animals are there to serve humans, plants are there to sustain animals, and so on. And he thought that each of those boxes is defined by certain essential characteristics. Say, humans are rational, they are defined by their capacity for rational thought, whereas a dog is defined by him or her having four legs, behaving in a certain way. So there are certain characteristics that define what it is to be a dog, and that is different from the definition of a cow or a cat, and so on. So the idea here is that there's a hierarchy of different categories, like well-defined categories of being, um, and those boundaries between those boxes, between those categories, are fixed and clear. So that's the scientific side of things. And then I also already talked a little bit about the moral kind of things that kind of corresponded to that, where the idea is that animals, non-human animals, are there to serve humans and so on. Now, I think that Aristotle was wrong both morally and as a matter of empirical science. And we can easily understand that and agree to that when it comes to his views about women, for example, right? Let's talk about that first to illustrate what I'm challenging. Uh, Aristotle wrote that although women have a deliberative faculty, it is, and I wrote it down to not misquote him, he wrote that the deliberative faculty of women is, quote, without authority. Um, so that, in his view, females require male supervision. He wrote that, quote, the relation of male to female is naturally that of the superior to the inferior, of the ruling to the ruled. So that was his view of women. So in that hierarchy, women are inferior to men because supposedly they are less rational. Now, we know today, of course, that he was wrong from a scientific perspective, right? Women are no less rational than men. But importantly, he was also morally wrong, right? Even if it was true that women were less rational, which it is not, but even if it was true, that would not mean that they're less deserving of respectful treatment, right? One just doesn't follow from the other. We afford the same respect, the same fundamental right to people who are less rational than we are. We afford the same fundamental right to small children that we afford to adults. So rationality is not uh, it's not a requirement to have a certain level of rationality to be deserving of fundamental respect and rights. So he was wrong, I would argue, both scientifically and morally. And just like he was wrong about women and also about slavery, by the way, he famously defended slavery. Just like he was wrong about people of different races and of the opposite sex, he was wrong about animals. And here again, also both scientifically and morally. Scientifically, um, we now know, at least since the publication of Darwin's The Origin of Species, that nature is not organized in neatly separated categories of being. Rather, all life on Earth is interrelated. And those characteristics that Aristotle thought defined one category or the other, in fact, come in degree and can be found in varying degrees throughout nature. For example, if we think about rationality, it is not true that all human beings are wholly rational and all other animals are wholly irrational. Rather, um, some people are more rational, some are less rational, and we can find varying degrees of rationality in individuals that belong to other species as well. There is fascinating research about the ability of certain great apes to use tools, right, or engage in other rational conduct. So we can find rationality in animals as well. We could find pretty much any quality that we find in humans in other animals as well to varying degrees. And there are individuals of other species that are superior in certain ways to some individuals in our species. So the real picture is much more complicated than what Aristotle would have us believe. It's much more messy and complex, right? We cannot think of nature as this neatly compartmentalized system, right, where we can draw clear lines. That just isn't true anymore. So that's the scientific side of things. I think he was wrong about that. Again, we can't fault him to that. He didn't know what we know today, right? Darwin hasn't had not done his research yet back then. So he was wrong about that, just like he was wrong about uh, women, and that's okay, right? That's how science works. We make progress over the centuries, and he was also wrong uh, morally, even if it was true that all animals were, like, let's say, less rational than all people, which it isn't. But even if it was true, that would not settle the question of whether they deserve moral equality and certain fundamental rights.
So that was an interesting and I think a bit convincing argument, because this is the process of science. We
Right.
progress and from mistakes or from shortcomings, and that is okay. Maybe it's a good time to revisit some of the comments we have received, and then we'll come back to our program. So Niladri Chatterjee from University of Oslo says, fantastic. So it's a good feedback that we're having a fantastic discussion. Thank you, Niladri. Um, Professor Abdus Samad from Jagannath University says, wonderful. And Taj Hashmi says, if I recall correctly, Aristotle believed women had no souls. So he is again supporting your point of view.